This video will finish out our discussion of Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, the final section of Chapter 4, the restriction of being, which concerns being and the ought. And this section actually concerns not only the ought, but also involves a sort of conspectus and conclusion to the work as a whole. So there will be two parts to this video lecture. First, Heidegger's discussion of the ought and its separation from being, and then second, his conclusion to Introduction to Metaphysics as a whole. Now, after Plato, being more and more becomes grounded in thinking. Thinking is what underlies being. However, there also comes to stand something over being. This is the ought. How can something stand over being? Well, only because being, within the so-called theory of ideas, is no longer what provides the measure, is no longer what is definitive. Heidegger traces this consequence to the interpretation of being as prototype. He says, end of first paragraph, page 219, the ideas no longer provide the measure. For as that which offers a look, and thus in a certain way is something that is, the idea, as such a being, demands in turn the determination of its being. That is, once again, a single look. In other words, Platonism construes being as idea, eidos. Eidos is whatness, what provides the look of a thing. Thus, all particular things are only insofar as they are provided their look by the idea that is their prototype. For instance, a tree is only insofar as there is some idea that provides it with the look of a tree. This condition, however, that things are only insofar as there's some idea that provides them with their look and hence their being, hence only insofar as they participate in an idea, this condition is a completely general condition. It's a condition of being and hence completely general. Therefore, it applies to ideas as well. There must be some idea that gives them, the ideas, the look of an idea, just as there must be an idea that gives a tree the look of a tree. This is what Plato designates as the idea or form of the good. Good in the sense of agathon, A-G-A-T-H-O-N. The ought is construed as the good. So what is the good as Plato conceives of it? Agathon refers to the good in the sense, Heidegger says, of the valiant, the fulfillment of the ideal of the human, of manly or aristocratic virtue. This is not the moral good or the good in the sense of what generates an orderly and well-behaved society. The good has to be understood as what first enables a prototype, which is how an idea, of course, is being construed here as a prototype. The good has to be understood as what first enables a prototype as a prototype, enables it to be a prototype, to have its prototypical status. And thus it has to have the power or the potency to do so, and this obviously has to be the greatest power or potency. This is the archetype that provides the prototypical power to the prototypes. Their power to be prototypes, to be the standards of particular things. Furthermore, since the ideas collectively constitute being, understood as ousia or substance, this archetype of the prototypes must be beyond being, beyond substance. That is Plato's view of the good. It is beyond being. And so we can remind ourselves of this famous passage in Plato's Republic, where Socrates declares This is around page 509 of the standard pagination. Quoting, what the good itself is in the intelligible realm in relation to understanding and intelligible things, the sun is in the visible realm in relation to sight and visible things. Skipping a little bit farther down the page. What gives truth to the things known and the power to know the knower is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Glaucon responds to Socrates, this is an inconceivably beautiful thing that you're talking about if it provides both knowledge and truth and is superior to them in beauty. Socrates says, you'll be willing to say, I think, that the sun not only provides visible things with the power to be seen, but also with coming to be, growth and nourishment, although it is not itself coming to be. Glaucon says, how could it be? Socrates, therefore you should also say that not only do the objects of knowledge owe their being known to their good, but their being is also due to it, the good, although the good is not being, but superior to it in rank and power. So there we see quite clearly Plato has Socrates declare the good is not being, although superior to it in rank and power. The good is beyond being. It is not a being. It is beyond being and superior to being. It is over being. It is above being. Now for Heidegger, the separation of being from the ought is not the imposition of something external over being. As in other cases, it derives from a possibility within being itself. As being becomes circumscribed within its characterization as idea, it is degraded from being phusis to being a mere look, a mere consequence of phusis. In this degradation, a remainder of the essence of being is left over. Something that must be posited in Platonism in order to make up for Platonism's degraded interpretation of being. And this is what the good is, which represents being's alienated predominance over the look, eidos. Thus, here we have the origin of the separation of being and the ought in Plato, which, like the other separations from becoming, seeming, and thinking, really belongs at a deeper, unseen level to aspects of being itself. Interestingly, Heidegger here seems to explicitly claim something that has mostly been kept implicit. On page 220, he says, in all the determinations of being and of separations we have mentioned, we must keep one thing in view. Because being is inceptively phusis, arising on concealing sway, it itself exhibits itself as eidos and idea. This exposition is never based exclusively or even primarily on its being interpreted by philosophy. He seems to be implying here that his interpretation of being as phusis has a special status. Unlike, say, Plato's or Aristotle's interpretation of being, his is not an interpretation, but an account of the inception itself. So it's not just one interpretation among others. More modestly, maybe we could say on Heidegger's behalf that Heidegger's interpretation is the only one that can account for all of the data and make sense of how supposedly opposed things can still belong to being, as becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought evidently do. When the ought arises in opposition to being, thinking has to assume a new decisive role. It has to determine the good in opposition to being. In the modern era, especially in Kant and post-Kantian German idealism, the predominance of the ought over being reached its pinnacle. In Kant, being is interpreted as nature. That is, whatever can be determined in mathematical, physical thinking. in Heidegger's words. What nature for Kant is whatever can be determined in mathematical physical thinking. The ought is for Kant rooted in the categorical imperative, which is the principle of pure a priori reason, and stands opposed to and over against nature. Kant's disciple Johann Gottlieb Fichte transformed this oppositional relation of the ought to nature into the very principle of his metaphysical system. However, after German idealism began to wane, nature began to predominate over the ought in later 19th century philosophy. For example, in positivism and in neo-Kantianism, various forms of materialism, nature came to predominate over the ought, to such an extent that the ought was endangered altogether. For example, reduced to mere subjective emotion, so-called. In an attempt to rescue the ought from the onslaught of positivism and scientific materialism, some people have resorted to an appeal to an entity that supposedly grounds the ought in itself, namely values. Values. So we see in the later 19th century the advent of the theory of values as a branch of philosophy. It's conceded that since they stand outside of and opposed to being, which is now in the late modern era typically restricted to the material, to the naturalistic in the scientific sense, since they stand outside of and opposed to being understood in this way, values do not really have being. That's the common belief. Values do not really have being. Hence, a substitute for being is granted to them, validity. When do values have validity? Well, typically, this is uncovered in the scientific scholarly investigations of the historical and so-called social sciences. Values, it is discovered in these sciences, are ubiquitous in history. And they're even determinative of the course of history. History is nothing but the actualization of values. Hence, the ought is now guaranteed a positivity and an empirical basis that even modern science can study. It can determine the values of the Greeks, the values of the Hebrews, the values of the Crow Nation, etc., as real, positive, causal forces in history. From the modern historical perspective, it then becomes easy to misinterpret Plato's ideas as values. After all, the values are the prototypes, and as such, they provide the standard for things. And values, everyone now knows, or thinks they know, values are what provide the standards for things. Therefore, it obviously follows that Plato's ideas are values. What is easier than to conclude that Plato's ideas are values? This is what Heidegger says here. And whenever you see Heidegger use this locution, what is easier? What could be easier? What he means by that is, what could be more lazy and thoughtless? That's basically what Heidegger is saying when he says, what could be easier than this? But there's still a problem with values so construed. They still seem to be too subjective. Maybe the social scientist or the historian can study values objectively, but this is only as they are held by people. And that seems to make values too dependent on the subject, hence of tenuous being. And of course, from the first person perspective, you can ask yourself, well, why should I hold the values I hold? Not just for the sake of convenience of some social scientist or historian, so they can later on study the behavior of my tribe, right? And treat our values as something positive. So the solution to this is often thought to be something very simple and straightforward. Propose that there are objective values. Objective values. Once the ought is construed as objective values, however, it becomes just another present at hand thing, and a whole host of paradoxes and confusions arise. And in the tradition of modern Anglophone moral philosophy, ethical theory, a famous example of this is found in this book by John Mackey, J.L. Mackey, ethics, inventing right and wrong, very well known by specialists in ethical theory in the Anglophone countries. Mackey is a famous example of someone who makes precisely this error of interpreting Plato's ideas as objective values. Let's read a little bit of this just to get the flavor of it. This is beginning on page 38, a section entitled "The Argument from Queerness." Queerness. Mackey writes, "If there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. Correspondingly, if we were aware of them, it would have to be by some special faculty of moral perception or intuition, utterly different from our ordinary ways of knowing everything else." Skipping ahead a page, Mackey says, "Plato's forms give a dramatic picture of what objective values would have to be." What could be easier than to find an example of objective values in Plato's forms? Heidegger would be shaking his head if he weren't already dead by the time this was published. "The form of the good is such that knowledge of it provides the knower with both a direction and an overriding motive. Something's being good both tells the person who knows this to pursue it and makes him pursue it." You can see the ought. That's what the ought does. It tells someone who receives this ought what to pursue and makes them pursue it. An objective good, continuing on with Mackey here, an objective good would be sought by anyone who is acquainted with it, not because of any contingent fact that this person or every person is so constituted that he desires this end, that is not in the sense of the original sense of value as a kind of subjective inclination, but just because the end has to be pursued. Excuse me, let me start that again. But just because the end has to be pursuedness, hyphenated, to be pursuedness. An objective value has to be pursuedness somehow built into it. Similarly, if there were objective principles of right and wrong, any wrong possible course of action would have to have not to be doneness, again hyphenated, not to be doneness, somehow built into it. Another way of bringing out this queerness is to ask about anything that is supposed to have some objective moral quality, how this is linked with its natural features. What is the connection between the natural fact that an action is a piece of deliberate cruelty, say causing pain just for fun, and the moral fact that it is wrong? It cannot be an entailment, a logical or semantic necessity. Yet it is not merely that the two features occur together. The wrongness must somehow be consequential or supervenient. It is wrong because it is a piece of deliberate cruelty. But just what in the world, and Mackey emphasizes that, just what in the world is signified by this because? Where do we find values objectively in the world? That's what he's asking. And how do we know the relation that signifies if this is something more than such actions being socially condemned and condemned by us too, perhaps through our having absorbed attitudes from our social environment? There you see at the bottom the retreat back to the social scientific or historical conception of values as social facts. Yeah, okay, we can concede that as a social fact, the values of the Greeks, the values of the Hebrews, the values of the Crow nation exist objectively in a sense as a social fact, but objective values as something that has to be pursuedness or not to be doneness objectively built into it. Mackey says, how queer, how strange. So a host of paradoxes and confusions seem to arise once we try to transfer this notion of a value, which originally has its seat in this modern notion of subjectivity and the positing of values out of your own will or out of your own inclinations. Once you try to transfer that into the objective sphere and say there are these things that are objective values that as a matter of objective fact have this to be pursuedness or not to be doneness objectively built into it. Heidegger clearly regards this as kind of a reductio ad absurdum of this sort of philosophical move of positing values as objective. Speaking of reductio ad absurdums of philosophy, or potential ones, it's in this context that Heidegger makes his notorious remark about the inner truth and greatness of National Socialism. So here's the quote, trigger alert, top of page 222. In 1928, there appeared the first part of a collected bibliography on the concept of value. It cites 661 publications on the concept of value. Probably by now there are 1,000. All this calls itself philosophy. In particular, what is peddled about nowadays as the philosophy of National Socialism, but which has not the least to do with the inner truth and greatness of this movement, is fishing in these troubled waters of values and totalities. Later on, Heidegger inserted as a qualifier about this inner truth and greatness, namely the encounter between global technology and modern humanity, which itself is not entirely clear. Well, I feel that this black mark on the introduction to metaphysics at least needs to be called out and acknowledged. But I don't have anything in particular more to say about it, other than to note that one can at least infer that Heidegger is not here endorsing Nazi values. If the movement contains inner truth and greatness, then it must lie elsewhere than in its values. Needless to say, I hope it's needless to say, the idea that there is anything whatsoever that is true or great about Nazism in any sense, even in 1935, before the atrocities of the war and the death camps, is a highly dubious suggestion, to put it mildly. If the fact that Heidegger once thought this invalidates everything that he has to say philosophically for you, then that's your personal choice. Obviously, I've made a different choice, but it is, in my view, up to each individual to decide for themselves. As far as Nazism's literal relation to the ought goes, we can take it as a given that you ought not to become a Nazi, and you ought to oppose Nazism. On that, we can all agree, I assume, even if we don't agree on the definition of Nazism nowadays. Nazi seems to have a functional definition of anyone who's significantly more right-wing than I am is a Nazi. And that itself is rather unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. Enter Nietzsche. Nietzsche was someone whom Heidegger respected, who nevertheless fell into the trap of value talk. According to Heidegger, Nietzsche, quote, thinks completely within the perspective of the representation of values. Nietzsche is completely entrapped by this perspective of value. This entanglement in values was fateful for Nietzsche, according to Heidegger. In spite of the many debts that Heidegger owes to Nietzsche, most of which are unacknowledged in this book, but are obvious to anyone with a deep experience with Nietzsche, Heidegger says that the limitations of the perspective of value confused Nietzsche at a fundamental level and kept him from reaching what he calls the genuine center of philosophy. So that basically is what Heidegger has to say about the ought and its separation from being. And this leads us to our first discussion question, which is this. What is the ought, really? What are we referring to when we use the term ought in our assertions? Should we view it in Platonic Kantian fashion as a being that is separate from and beyond all substances, setting the standard for all substances, or opposed to them metaphysically? Or alternatively, should we perhaps view it as a value, whether subjective or objective? Is there any other way to construe the metaphysical status of the ought other than these two? What aspect of being is unconcealed or disclosed by the ought? Does Heidegger have the philosophical resources to give an adequate account of the being of the ought? So once again, first discussion question, what is the ought really? What are we referring to when we use the term ought in our assertions? Should we view it in Platonic Kantian fashion as a being that's separate from and beyond all substances, setting the standard for all substances, or opposed to them metaphysically? Or alternatively, should we perhaps view it as a value, whether a subjective value or an objective value? Is there any other way to construe the metaphysical status of the ought besides these two? What aspect of being is unconcealed or disclosed by the ought? Does Heidegger have the philosophical resources to give an adequate account of the being of the ought? Second part of the section, the conclusion of the book. At this point, Heidegger has completed his discussion of the four restrictions of being: becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought. Thus, he returns to the list of 7 points of orientation, as he called them, that he laid down back in page 103 in our translation. He returns to this list in order to chart the progress that has been made in his philosophical investigations. The four separations serve an important function in the inquiry into being. They are restrictions, not just in a negative sense, but in the sense that they enable being to be determined more exactly. Restrictions on meaning are positive things, because otherwise every word would mean the same thing. All four of the separated aspects are, as we've seen, interrelated. They form a kind of system and paint a picture, as it were, of being. This system is not something that Heidegger constructed. It's not externally imposed from the outside on some indifferent material. Rather, it unfolds with a kind of necessity from the nature of being itself. The only way to truly see this is historically, by going back to the origin, seeing where and how the separations took place, and tracing their historical development. That is, of course, what Heidegger has been doing in this book. This is not an idle or academic project only. These distinctions have shaped thinking, knowing, and doing in the West for 2.5 millennia. So if we want to understand who we are as a culture, this is an absolutely indispensable exercise. That doesn't mean that it is for everyone or that it is easy. On the top of page 224, Heidegger says, asking the question of being in an originary way, in a way that grasps the task of unfolding the truth of the essence of being, means facing the decision regarding the concealed powers in these separations, and it means bringing them back to their own truth. And we might emphasize this last line here. It means bringing them back to their own truth. Heidegger doesn't emphasize it in that way, but I think it captures the sense of what he's getting at here, because we have a tendency to get lost in what we sometimes call our truth, my truth, our habitual ways of thinking, speaking, and behaving. But this obscures the originary self-disclosure of being. So we have to perform a kind of act of violence on ourselves. Heidegger doesn't say that here, but it's very much in his spirit, I think. We have to perform a kind of act of violence on ourselves in order to acquire the eyes to see and the ears to hear being. Thus, Heidegger is demanding something of us that is challenging, hard, and unsettling. One might ask, what gives him the right to issue such a demand? The legitimacy of the demand to face the decision is the final topic that Heidegger addresses in the book. In order to show that, as he says, quote, the demand is justified and its fulfillment necessary, unquote. In order to show that, we must cast an eye once again over the entirety of what's been covered in this work. Heidegger had started with the question, why is there anything rather than nothing? Which led him to a prior question, how does it stand with being as such? At first, being appeared as an empty word with an elusive meaning, but eventually it was shown that this word represents what is most worthy of questioning. Being is not one fact among other present at hand facts. Instead, it is the fundamental happening that first opens up beings as a whole. Thus, it's not meaningless at all, but the very basis of the meaning of everything that is. For us Westerners, however, this meaning is the meaning of being that has been determined by the interpretation of being that came about in Plato and Aristotle. Its main features are that the infinitive to be derives its meaning from the is of assertion. that being is contrasted with becoming as the enduring. Being is contrasted with seeming as the constancy of the idea, the prototype which always is. Being is what lies at the basis, the present at hand, in opposition to thinking, the substance that stands over against thinking about it, judgment of it. Being is what is actual, as opposed to what ought to be or what ought to have been actualized. This summarizes the very determinate meaning that being has for us. It is not accidental, subjective, or optional even. It's the historical fate that we have inherited as heirs to Western civilization. It's the natural meaning of being for us. The question is this a solid understanding of being, one that's capable of standing and supporting the West, our historical Dasein, and carrying us into the future? Or, by contrast, is it getting a little wobbly? Heidegger's answer is clear. We as Westerners are, in his words, staggering. We're staggering through history like drunken sailors. We are confused. We no longer know how it stands with being. Obviously, Heidegger doesn't mean that we can't uncover and elucidate our Western understanding of being historically, since he's just done that. But rather, the problem is that this notion of being no longer really convinces us. It no longer feeds the soul. It no longer resonates with us. And it's no longer really intelligible to us. I think at bottom, that's the real problem. Its intelligibility is wobbling. It's not stable. This is nihilism. At its most fundamental level, nihilism is what we might call a crisis of meaning. In nihilism, we chase after beings, Heidegger says. We chase after beings in the midst of the oblivion of being. So, nihilism, it's not that we lack a sense of what matters. We always already know what matters. We know this very well. What matters? Instagram followers, a healthy 401k, Facebook friends, a shiny SUV every 3 years, the latest iPhone in our pocket, a new season of the NFL each fall, etc., etc. The problem is we don't know why any of this matters. There is, at the boundaries, at the edges of our frenetic culture, a vague sense of unease, malaise, foreboding, the sense of a nothing that surrounds us. In fact, the frantic pace of our culture masks a semi-conscious effort to avoid a confrontation with the nothing. But for Heidegger, bravely confronting the nothing is the only way that we can hope to recover from our oblivion of being, to overcome the meaningless activity that is the sign of our modern nihilism. Part of this recovery is reintegrating becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought into being, rather than setting them off in separate opposition to being, as Western metaphysics has done since Plato. If we do this, we realize with Heidegger that, quote, the concept of being that has been accepted up to now does not suffice to name everything that is, unquote. The concept of being that has been accepted up to now does not suffice to name anything that is. There is, as it were, surrounding our world, the realm of the unnameable, or the not yet named. Perhaps the nameable, but not yet named. At any rate, we must recover being by experiencing it anew. In what way? Heidegger says on page 227, for those powers that stand against being, the intricately interwoven separations themselves, have long determined, ruled, and pervaded our Dasein, and keep it in confusion regarding being. And so, from the originary questioning of the four separations, there grows the insight that being, which is encircled by them, must itself be transformed into the encompassing circle and ground all beings. The originary separation, whose intensity and originary disjunction sustains history, is the distinction between being and beings. In other words, we must recognize that being is not a present-at-hand being at all that is encompassed at its borders by, as it were, hostile neighbors, namely becoming, seeming, thinking, and the ought. But rather, those things are encompassed by being, because being is not a present-at-hand being at all, being with a capital B. It surrounds and encompasses all becoming, all seeming, all thinking, and even the ought. And the only way we can keep this truth in focus is by maintaining the distinction between being and beings. The forgetting of this distinction results in the reduction of being, capital B, to just another being, small b, and thereby the oblivion and forgetting of being, capital B. But how are we to think this distinction? Heidegger asks, this distinction between being and beings. It seems like an odd question. Isn't thinking this distinction precisely what we have been doing here? Yes, but maybe not. The experience is what matters. We can talk about the being of beings, and yet that talk can be mere talk, mere hearsay. That's why it's so essential for Heidegger to get the sound of ancient Greek poetry in one's ears, to go back to the source texts of the Western tradition and re-experience what was experienced at the inception. This will be, at the same time, a rediscovery of our own being, of what we are as human beings, of what it means to be, namely not a present-at-hand thing among other present-at-hand beings, but rather a site, S-I-T-E, site, a site for the opening up of being. But how is this opening up to take place in our own age? In a sense, we do not know the answer to this question yet. How is this opening to take place in our own age? We do not quite know. Other than that questioning being will itself prepare and perhaps constitute this openness. Being able to question means being able to wait for the right time for the question. But our age is an age that is impatient, that doesn't know how to count the greatness of a thing except in terms of fast profits. Thus, saith Heidegger's favorite poet, Friedrich Hölderlin, thus does the mindful God detest us.